talking about the value of independence today, which seems most appropriate since yesterday, at least in this country, we celebrated the 4th of July, Independence Day. But this is going beyond, any local celebration or country celebration. And this is really the skinny, can we call that? The skinny of what spiritual independence is and the value of it. From the teachings, talking about independence, it makes an interesting statement. I'm not quite sure why, but maybe by the end of the talk we'll get a better perspective of it. The teaching says that every advancing human soul needs to know about the significance of independence. So let's just assume that all of you who are on our webinar today, and by the way, welcome, and all of us here physically, we're all advancing souls. So this means it's really important that we understand the significance of independence. And as our understanding of the significance of independence grows, the teaching challenges us to pass our knowledge on to others through conversation, through lectures, through our writings. So as I'm sharing some of this information this morning, also think about your personal experiences, the value that you realized when you recognized that you were detaching yourself from certain elements in your life that had a stranglehold over you. It could be people, it could be places, it could be ideas, it could be philosophies, nations, culture. It's really amazing how objects in our life become so predominant that without even realizing it, it begins to control us, and then we become attached. So spiritually, independence has several layers. One is the process of attachment from all transient objects in the world. So that's the first point. The first point is detachment. We want to detach ourselves from all transient objects in the world. This doesn't mean that we can't have this or that we can't have money. It doesn't mean we can't own property. It doesn't mean we can't have friends or anything like that. It means essentially that our heart should not be attached to them. As long as a person's heart is attached to ephemeral things of the world, then the teaching indicates that we're not going to find independence. This means that this person will live as a slave to objects to which we are attached. So if we're just listening to this mentally, or with our concrete mind, we're going to rebel. But if you keep an open mind and maybe go back to an experience that you had where it would have been better for you emotionally, mentally, physically, if you hadn't globbed onto that, situation, and instead had a little bit more freedom from it, it would have been better for you. So I think that as individuals, perhaps even groups, that we must strive for independence. Even if independence is not possible, and this is from the teaching, it says that our intuition, even if independence is not possible right now for a certain element, our intuition is going to be aware of these things. And at a given time, in the right state of consciousness and the right beingness, we will actualize independence. So that's the first layer of understanding regarding independence. So it is going to happen. The second layer of independence perhaps is a little bit more challenging, and this is independence from our glamours. It's not easy to destroy one's glamours, but if we can become aware of them and observe them closely, then we can have a chance in the future to destroy them. So apparently the first challenge is to be able to recognize them. But before that lucky day, we can learn to detach ourselves from our glamours. We can learn how to do this and obviously closely observe them. Detachment from glamours is the first step of independence from our astral plane. So try to observe your individual and group and family life closely, and you will see that there are really not many people or groups who are scientifically working to detach and eventually to destroy their glamours. Glamours are devastating to people because through glamours, our attachment is involuntary. Our attachment is involuntary. It causes retrogression in the life of the people, and it produces pain and suffering and exploitation and bossiness and domineeringness. So nature is watching all that is going on, and often it interferes with the intention to enlighten us. Nature creates those conditions that we call natural cataclysms, widespread destruction, suffering and pain, because it is possible that through such painful conditions, the people will learn to detach from their glamours and step onto the evolutionary path. So, if we go back for just a brief moment here, where the teaching says that spiritual independence is so important for advancing human souls to know about it, and then to share what we know with others. And then part of the second layer is to learn how to observe ourselves closely, how to observe our glamours, and then how to understand how can attachment be involuntary to these glamours. It's a tremendous study, and I've spent years studying this. I mean, believe me, I have. As I'm trying to peel away these glamours that seem to glob on one life after another, after another, after another, and they just build, upon themselves, and then we involuntarily become attached. So I guess if the teaching is saying that observation is the first key to understanding, then we need to learn what observation is, not to observe others, but to be involved with our own, personal observation. Now, we are also told that pain and suffering are principles that are used by Sanat for millions of years to bring people to their senses and lead them to independence. Glamours. What are glamours? Glamours are actually force centers. So here's a real clear definition. If you don't really or haven't ever really understood, the esoteric definition of glamours, this is it. First, that it is actually a force center or patterns in our astral world. A force center or patterns in our astral world which correspond to centers in our etheric body and the etheric stratosphere, can I say, of the planet. So when we think of etheric centers that surround the planet, then we can even understand a little bit more how our attachment to glamours become involuntary, because it is a world problem. And these glamours are created from humanity, of which we are a part. And then, because these force centers become part of the centers, or interact and influence and ignite these senses or centers in our etheric body, the result is the involuntary attachment and pain and suffering. So these are patterns. Glamours can be patterns. They cause the forces to flow in certain patterns, in certain ways, and in certain frequencies, controlling our expression in our physical, etheric, and astral behaviors. I was talking with someone the other day about high-level music can change these forced etheric patterns, like changing a square to a triangle pattern. And in this process, it brings about transformation. So as we change these patterns that are the result of a glamour, we are in fact changing our whole nature, our human constitution, expanding our consciousness and changing our beingness. Sacred dance can do the same thing, such as Gurdjieff dances, Sufi dances. But you're going to find that people's glamours are going to react to such kind of music and sound and rhythms. This recently happened at a conclave I attended, where we presented some really beautiful high-level music that was created on the higher mental plane, and people didn't understand it. They were resistant, and they were reactive, and they didn't understand the rhythm. They wanted 4/4, not 6/8. So a glamour can also be defined as a state of feeling in love with oneself. Most people are in love with themselves to such a degree that they separate themselves from others by many kinds of rationalizations. They are not interested in others unless others serve their self-interest. Such kind of glamours must be eliminated if a person wants to progress on the path of his divine destiny. To further explain a glamour is a desire of any kind on the astral plane which is ensouled. Once the glamour becomes ensouled, it makes it a forceful, dominating factor in your life, blinding and misleading the person in all his expressions and relationships in order to secure its satisfaction and survival. So obviously, we want to gain an independence or freedom from these glamours. Now, the third level of independence is detachment from our illusions and self-image. We do love our false images of self, our pseudo-images. We must realize that our self-image is a limiting factor in our life. If it does not develop into a progressively better self-image, then a pseudo-image enslaves us to whatever level of consciousness we are functioning, at this moment. So these images are impressed by others upon us, or we build them even by imitating others. People always imitate, but are not aware that imitation is a labor to build self-image. We build our self-image also through our imagination, through our hallucinations, through our vanity and our ego, and often worship it with such great adoration. In the esoteric community, we find these false images established due to the lack of assimilating the teaching appropriately. And as such, building images are then based on certain imaginations, such as being in direct contact with the master or other great beings, or that being on a spiritual path makes us better than others, or more holy. See, these are false images. So now this is interesting. If you were identified with an image, let's say 40 years ago, that image may become re-stimulated. It can come back into power and control your life. It is a heavy esoteric psychology to discover how most of our actions are controlled by these pseudo-self-images. Our progress depends upon the degree of our detachment from greed and from obsession, from detachment from our glamours and from our illusions, and detachment from our pseudo-self-images and hallucinations. The advancing, illumined people in the world must think about these ideas and spread them and lead society to a new level of beingness. Nations are dependent on each other politically, economically, and biologically. We saw this the first part of this past week, with Greece being unable to pay its debts. We saw the Dow drop nearly 400 plus points, dropping below 18,000 points. Greece failed to meet its deadline to pay 1.6 billion euros it owed to the International Money Fund on Tuesday, the same day that had brought an end to the country's year-long bailout program. They had a program given to them. Greece's failure to make the deadline was the first time a developed country ever missed a payment to the IMF. See the detachment? Nations are also related to each other in business, through pollution in the air and water, and through sickness and health. So the meaning of independence is not related only to the objective world, but also to the subjective psychological world. There is not a single individual, group or nation or family that is totally independent from other individuals, other groups or nations. The real law that holds all manifested forms together then is what? So shock you. It's the law of dependence. If we learn the message of this law, we can understand the subjective law of independence. Actually, members of humanity are dependent on each other physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. The only independence is psychological, and its progressive expansion of consciousness and beingness that is achieved through breaking all obstacles and hindrances that prevent us from reaching perfection and synthesis. No one can enter into the spheres of greater light if they do not strive for true independence. Okay, so what is making us slaves to things and to people in our life? The teachings tell us we are eating, drinking, smoking, and doing drugs, and it's going to become more prevalent for a while now that states are making marijuana legal. I'm not talking about medical marijuana. I'm talking about using marijuana as a form of entertainment. Eventually, the medical community will discover that our young people's brains are shrinking rather than maturing. They will discover early on memory loss and dementia occurring at younger ages, all due to marijuana. They will begin to discover marijuana has led to forms of mental health, laziness, lack of creativity, and other things. But now many people are happy that it is finally becoming legal. It is a new long-term addiction coming into young and old people's lives that will affect future incarnations. We have habits, hang-ups, inertia, gluttony, blind urges and drives. As we wake up, we are going to find a great joy in us, for we are going to let the light illumine these problems within us. And there will be a spontaneous response to undergo sublimation and transformation. We are stuck with things that are sucking our energy, wasting our life and creating problems. There's only one difference. Either we are controlled or we are controlling. Either our life is in our own hands or we are in the hands of who knows what. So I have a nice little story here. I'm going to end up early this morning, so if you can think of any questions, we'll have time to take them. A Chinese Zen teacher lived alone in a small temple in the country. One day, 4 traveling monks appeared and asked if they might make a fire in his yard to warm themselves. While they were building the fire, the teacher heard them arguing about subjectivity and objectivity. He joined them and he said, "There's a big stone. Do you consider to be inside or outside your mind?" One of the monks replied, "Well, from the Buddhist viewpoint, everything is an objectification of the mind. So I would say that the stone is inside my mind." "Well," said the teacher, "your head must feel very heavy if you are carrying around a stone like that in your mind." The teachings give us lists of glamours that are related to the 7 universal energies, and also gives us hints about certain illusions that we are carrying around in our minds, which we attach ourselves to, and then become each glamour and become each illusion. Glamours and illusions are like carrying around a stone. So many stones in our mind that control our life, our self-image, and our relationships. Someday we must take some time to discover what glamours and illusions we are carrying around, like these stones in our mind. and begin the transformative process. Such progress will illumine your mind and free your heart from many obstacles. So let me close with this clever Buddhist story. One day a great Lama was bestowing teachings on a large gathering, and an old lady came to receive the empowerment. In Tibet, it is customary to present a goodwill offering at the end of such an empowerment as a token of gratitude. This old woman had a kilo of fresh yak butter to offer, one of the principal mediums of exchange in Tibet. It was in a satchel under her cloak, and she had intended to offer it to the master after receiving his blessing. However, this day, there were a great many recipients gathered. So when the Lama reached the portion of the empowerment during which he would ordinarily touch each disciple on the head with a sacred vessel filled with nectar, this time he simply instructed them to all visualize the vase he was holding on his head, and then to imagine him placing it at top of each of their heads. Okay, now this faithful old lady, needless to say, did exactly as was instructed and received the initiation in its entirety. But when the rite was completed and it was time to offer her precious butter to the Venerable Master, she merely stood up and uttered in a strong voice reminiscent of the Lamas and echoing his very words, "Now, simply visualize, Venerable Lama, that you are receiving as an offering this kilo of fine butter that you see in my hand." There are no shortcuts. We must do the work. Isn't that great? I thought, oh, wow. It says a lot. Okay, so that's what I have for you this morning. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
There's a question from the webinar.
Uh-huh.
The question is, what can we do to offset the popular public sentiment about legalizing recreational marijuana?
It's almost going to be an uphill battle. You know, I think about this real popular comedian, Bill Maher. He has a weekly program, and he openly talks about, you know, the joys and the positive side of, you know, enjoying marijuana, and he makes it so pleasant, you know, and so exciting to think, wow, this is going to happen. Finally, it's going to happen. And then he talks about, and rightly so, you know, of all the young people that are imprisoned now because of finding a little package of marijuana in their car or on their person, and they end up third time out, you go to prison, which is not good, obviously. But I've had so many experiences with young people, also old people, but more predominantly young people, that when they're in their mid or late teens began taking marijuana, using marijuana. They started out with small dosages, and then they found, and today the marijuana is so potent, you know, that the bigger the bong, I can't believe I said that. The greater the hit, the more effect it has on the brain. So over time, you can begin to see these children's behaviors change in such negative ways. Unfortunately, it takes place over a long period of time. But initially, you might recognize in some of these kids how they were very active and outgoing and, spent a lot of time in sports and activities, outside. And then pretty soon, their friendships changed. They changed from one circle to another circle. No more sports, no more creativity, more getting together with these new friends. Pretty soon they became belligerent with their parents, defying authority. The laziness is almost immediate. They don't take care of their room, they don't take care of themselves, they don't take baths every day, and so forth. And then ultimately, when they reach about age 23 and 24, the time when the maturity, the brain actually reaches full maturity, theirs hasn't. The good news for this, as in talking to a psychotherapist, really nice young man, very informed, and he's giving some of these kids hope, that their lives by now are falling apart. And he said the good news is if you stop abusing marijuana, just stop right now, your brain will heal itself. So I was so delighted to hear him say this, that there is hope. It's, there's light at the end of the tunnel. So the more experiences you have with the negative effects of marijuana, then you can talk one by one by one. So that's my answer. Any more questions?
I think you said imitation builds the self-image, and you were, I think, implying a negative a self-image that you needed to clear away.
Right.
Is imitation always?
No, it's not. This is the thing. When you're giving a lecture that you have a minimal amount of time, to convey a lot of words, it's good that you ask the question. Because the teaching tells us, particularly when we're young and idealistic, that if we have someone who is really great, who has been successful in their life and inspires us, we can put a picture of that person, in front of us. And each morning, it can serve as a reminder of what we ourselves want to be. But we're not going to imitate the personage, of that individual, but what they represent. So in so doing, let's say you take, let's for example, the Dalai Lama. When I was in India, and all places where there's heavy, and largely populated groups of Buddhists, you always see a picture of the Dalai Lama. And he's one of the most humble people we know that has such a worldly status. His image is to remind them of the principles and values of Buddhism, not of him. So in that case, but we're not imitating another human being, but the success and what brought about the success of that person.